Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a fascinating and incredibly practical framework from Happywise, all about what it truly takes to build the most authentic version of yourself. You'll notice right off the bat that we're keeping things super clean and focused today, with this minimal orange and green vibe, because we really want to zero in on the core ideas. And I want to clear something up right away. Your best self isn't some final destination. It's not a trophy you eventually unlock after a boss fight. It's actually a daily practice, an ongoing active alignment between who you really are and how you choose to live.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote from Socrates that completely anchors our entire discussion today. Know yourself, not as if it were easy, as if it were the most important work you can do. Honestly, this sets the stage perfectly. It establishes right away that true self-knowledge requires intentional and, yes, sometimes pretty uncomfortable inner work. It's definitely not something that just happens passively while you're going about your day.
So, that brings us to part 1, finding real self-knowledge.
See, because our brains are biologically wired to look outward by default, constantly scanning our environment for threats and opportunities, we actually have to intentionally force our focus inward. But here's the catch. There's a massive, stark difference between just ruminating and practicing intentional attention. Research by T. Urich totally dismantles the illusion that just thinking about yourself makes you self-aware. Rumination is really just unproductively spinning your wheels. It creates the feeling of knowing yourself without generating any real knowledge. True self-awareness is actively built through structured observation.
And a huge part of creating that structure comes down to the actual questions we ask ourselves. If you constantly ask why, as in, why am I like this, or why did that happen, you usually end up spiraling into unstructured overthinking. Honestly, it's a trap. Instead, the right questions to ask are what, how, and when. Shifting your mental rhetoric to these specific prompts pulls you right out of self-pity or endless analysis paralysis and moves you straight into action-oriented observation. It's a total game changer.
And this brilliantly illustrates our next point, the Johari window. This concept basically shows us that internal self-knowledge has a hard structural limit. By definition, our blind spots are literally invisible to us, yet they are often glaringly obvious to the people around us. So, asking for external feedback isn't just some nice-to-have bonus step for overachievers. It is absolutely structurally necessary to calibrate our true selves and achieve real grounded knowledge.
Which leads us perfectly into part 2, declared versus lived values.
So almost everyone has values they declare to the world, right? But very few of us actually pause to analyze whether our daily actions reflect them. DC and Ryan's self-determination theory points out that deep psychological well-being fundamentally depends on this exact integration. In fact, the psychological gap between the values we declare and the ones we actually live out is a massive source of chronic dissatisfaction. And a huge reason for this gap is that a lot of our values are just inherited. We passively absorb them from society. The emotional signal of an inherited value is usually a heavy feeling of obligation or guilt. Authentically chosen values, on the other hand, those generate real enthusiasm and a profound sense of meaning.
This misalignment often shows up loudest in how we handle failure. Take perfectionism, for example. Maladaptive perfectionism is entirely image-oriented. It's completely driven by a fear of seeming incompetent, which ultimately just produces paralysis. Healthy perfectionism, however, is process-oriented. It's the mindset of wanting to do something well simply because you genuinely care about the result, which actually gives you the permission to learn from your mistakes. As the source material beautifully points out, those who cannot afford to make mistakes simply cannot afford to learn.
Let's move on to part 3, pillars of authentic growth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it addresses the gap. To bridge that alignment gap, we need a system that works without forcing us to rely solely on exhausting willpower. The science of happiness points to specific foundational pillars, the first being plus being, with self-compassion as its absolute bedrock. Listen to this. Harsh, chronic self-criticism literally triggers your brain's biological threat system. It forces you to avoid errors and completely shuts down learning. But self-compassion? That activates your brain's safety system, freeing up your prefrontal cortex so you can actually process errors as useful data.
The second pillar is growing through others. We are fundamentally social creatures. Authentic growth doesn't happen in isolation. It is deeply social and absolutely relies on the quality of our relationships. There's this great concept called the proximal development zone, which basically means there are certain heights we can only reach with the support of another person. We don't grow in a vacuum, folks. We grow in relationship.
Moving right along to part 4, discipline and environment design.
Having the right mindset and the right people around you is amazing, but it isn't quite enough if your everyday environment is constantly working against you. To completely rethink discipline, we look to this incredibly powerful mindset shift from James Clear. Every action is a vote for the kind of person you want to be. This completely transforms discipline from a tedious, exhausting external chore into a daily, active expression of your true identity. You aren't forcing yourself. You are simply choosing behaviors that reflect who you are becoming.
And the easiest way to cast those good votes is by intentionally designing your environment, which acts as a huge biological lever. Consider this wildly striking data point. Just putting healthy food at eye level in a company canteen increases its consumption by 25%. Isn't that crazy? Just changing the shelf? Why? Because the human brain is hardwired to follow the path of least environmental resistance by default. If you make the good choices easy, your brain is just going to automatically take them.
We can apply this practically in our own lives through something called intentional friction, especially when it comes to our digital environments. Think about taking some really minimal practical steps today. Uninstall those quick response apps that just devour your attention without returning any real value. Activate your automatic time limits, and literally just put your phone in another room when you need to do deep work. By doing this, you are creating intentional friction to protect your values by design, making the behaviors that betray your values just a little bit more difficult to execute.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Part 5, the 4 energies of authentic growth.
So, when you successfully combine that inner self-knowledge with outward environment design, the first major payoff is a massive boost in emotional energy. Living in authentic alignment dramatically reduces chronic cognitive dissonance. You know that exhausting, persistent, heavy feeling in your gut when you're living against your own chosen values? Yeah, dropping that internal conflict frees up a staggering amount of emotional fuel.
Next up is physical energy. True alignment almost always includes caring for your body as a core expressed value. When you reframe your physical habits as daily votes for your identity rather than forced external obligations, those habits actually stick. You aren't forcing yourself to drag your feet to the gym. You are simply acting like the healthy person you've already decided to be.
Then, of course, we have mental energy. Think for a second about just how much brain power is wasted every single day when you constantly have to interpret yourself to meet other people's expectations. Authentic self-knowledge stops this right in its tracks. It frees up vast amounts of cognitive bandwidth, handing you back the mental resources you desperately need to actually think clearly, create, and make sound decisions.
Finally, we get to spiritual energy. And just to be clear, this isn't necessarily about religion at all. It's about integrity in the very literal sense of being whole. It's that profound, grounded sense that you are operating on a path you intentionally, purposefully chose for yourself, rather than just drifting on one imposed upon you by society or random circumstance.
And that brings us to the core truth of it all. The best version of you is found every single day in every single small choice that reflects who you truly are, instead of who you think you should be. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, provocative question to chew on after this explainer ends. If every action is a daily vote, what kind of person are you voting to become right now?